This is the story of how the United States Navy sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day in June of 1942, and how the most famous explanation for that victory was never actually true. For more than half a century, audiences have been told the battle came down to 5 minutes, the moment American dive bombers supposedly caught the Japanese carriers with their decks crowded by armed and fueled aircraft, only seconds from launching a strike that would have rewritten the war. That version makes for gripping television, and it falls apart under the evidence. What unfolded off Midway Atoll ran stranger and harder than the legend, and in some ways it deserves more respect. Victory grew out of broken codes, out of a lie about drinking water radioed across the Pacific, out of the near-total sacrifice of a generation of American torpedo pilots, and out of a handful of dive bombers that stumbled onto the enemy fleet almost by accident, dangerously low on fuel, guided only by the wake of a single Japanese destroyer. Over the next hour, the real Midway gets rebuilt one piece at a time, starting with the strategy, moving through the intelligence war, the opposing fleets, and the chaos of June 4th, and finishing with the famous 5 fateful minutes themselves and what the Japanese records actually reveal. By the end, the real question stops being how the United States won at Midway, and becomes why the truth ended up buried beneath a better story. To understand Midway, you have to back up 6 months, to December 7th of 1941, and the harbor at Pearl. In a single morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy shattered the battleship line of the United States Pacific Fleet, yet the one thing that attack failed to destroy turned out to be the thing that decided Midway, because the American aircraft carriers were nowhere near port that day. In the months that followed, Japan swept across the Pacific almost without opposition. One goal drove the entire campaign: to push the United States out of the Pacific long enough for Japan to lock in its conquests and force a negotiated peace. And reaching that goal meant finishing what Pearl Harbor had started by destroying the American carriers. That logic produced Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded Japan's combined fleet and designed the operation, cared little for the small atoll itself, and what he truly wanted was bait. A threat to Midway, in his thinking, would drag the outnumbered American carriers into the open, and once they came, his overwhelming fleet would close around them. Yamamoto's plan collided with reality a month early, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought from May 4th to May 8th of 1942. Coral Sea stands as the first carrier battle in history, 2 fleets that never once sighted each other, striking only through their aircraft, and although the fighting ended without a clear winner, it carried a consequence that would shadow Midway. 2 Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, took damage that left them out of the coming operation, which meant Yamamoto sailed for Midway without them. The prize itself barely registered on a map. Midway Atoll sits roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, a fleck of land adrift in the open Pacific, covering only about 2.5 square miles divided between 2 islands, Sand Island and the smaller Eastern Island. A sea captain named N.C. Brooks had claimed that Coral for the United States back in 1859, and by 1942 the insignificant speck had become the hinge the Pacific War would swing on. Yamamoto built a plan of enormous reach and intricacy, layered with feints, scattered task forces, and an invasion group, all timed across thousands of miles of ocean. The complexity wore the look of sophistication, and underneath it rested on one assumption above all, that the Americans would never see him coming. That assumption had already failed, and the reason it failed is the part of the Midway story that almost never makes the highlight reel. Midway was decided, in large part, before a single aircraft left a flight deck, and it was decided in a basement at Pearl Harbor by men who never fired a shot. By early 1942, codebreakers in the United States Navy had cracked their way into the Imperial Japanese Navy's main operational cipher, the one the Americans labeled JN-25. The team doing that work at Pearl Harbor went by the name station HYPO, and a commander named Joseph Rochefort ran it, piecing together fragments of Japanese traffic, never a whole message, just enough to assemble a picture. That picture pointed to something large aimed at a target the Japanese named only as AF. Rochefort's people grew steadily more convinced that AF meant Midway, and conviction was not proof, with the stakes far too high for a guess. If Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, threw his few carriers at the wrong island, the result could be ruin. Station HYPO answered with one of the most elegant tricks of the entire war. Midway received orders to broadcast a message in plain, uncoded language, claiming that the island's freshwater plant had failed and the garrison now ran short of water. The whole thing was a lie, sent in the clear, built to be overheard. The ruse worked almost at once, because not long after, American listeners intercepted a Japanese signal reporting that AF was short of fresh water, and the trap snapped shut. AF was Midway, and any remaining doubt evaporated. That single confirmation rearranged everything. It handed Nimitz a chance that should have been beyond a weaker force, the chance to lay an ambush, so instead of being lured out and slaughtered, the American carriers would wait northeast of Midway, tucked off the flank of the Japanese approach, ready to strike a fleet still convinced it owned the element of surprise. A line often credited to Nimitz called Midway a victory of intelligence, and the sentiment holds up. The codebreakers sank nothing, yet they delivered the one thing that counted against a stronger enemy, foreknowledge, and everything that happened on June 4th flowed straight out of that edge. Sit with what that edge actually meant. Two fleets were closing on each other in the middle of the Pacific, and one of them knew the other was coming, knew roughly when, and knew roughly from where, while the second knew none of it. In a battle waged across hundreds of miles by aircraft scanning empty water, that imbalance of knowledge outweighed any battleship, because the side that could see in the dark always held the first move. On paper, Midway should never have been close. Japan's force centered on the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, and at its core sailed 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were no ordinary ships, because all 4 had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and together they formed the finest, most battle-tested carrier force on the planet at that moment. Those carriers sailed in enormous company. The wider Japanese armada committed to Midway folded in light carriers, seaplane carriers, 7 battleships, somewhere near 15 cruisers, around 42 destroyers, and roughly 10 submarines, along with the transports carrying the invasion troops, which added up to one of the largest fleets assembled in the Pacific to that date. The United States answered with 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Around them steamed roughly 8 cruisers, about 15 destroyers, and some 16 submarines, backed by the aircraft based on Midway itself, so that the Americans could field on the order of 360 planes once you counted both the carrier squadrons and the island strips. American command split across the battle. Nimitz held overall authority back at Pearl Harbor, while at sea Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher carried tactical command through the early hours, flying his flag aboard Yorktown as head of Task Force 17. Enterprise and Hornet formed Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a commander who would face one of the most second-guessed decisions of the whole battle before it. Ended. One more man belongs in this picture, and he stood aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida had led the airstrike on Pearl Harbor, yet at Midway he never left the deck, grounded while he recovered from an emergency appendectomy, riding out the fighting aboard ship. That small detail carries enormous weight, because years afterward it would be Fuchida, more than anyone else, who shaped how the world chose to remember June 4th. Keep that name close, since he returns at the climax of this story. The decisive day arrived on June 4th, 1942. One warning before the timeline, the day descended into chaos, and the surviving clocks and logbooks from both sides flatly disagree, because men fighting for their lives were not pausing to check a watch, so every time that follows is the best approximation historians have managed to reconstruct. Around 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo threw his opening punch, a strike force of more than 100 aircraft sent to batter the island of Midway itself, while far to the northeast, the American carriers waited in silence, still unseen. At roughly 5:34, An American PBY Catalina patrol plane combing the empty ocean radioed that it had spotted the Japanese carriers, and the jaws of the ambush began to close. By about 5:53, Midway's radar caught the inbound Japanese strike at a range near 93 nautical miles, and the island flung its fighters skyward to meet it. Those defenders paid in blood. Near 6:20, American fighters flying from Midway slammed into the Japanese formation and absorbed heavy losses against more seasoned Japanese pilots and their escorts. All through the morning, planes based on the island, bombers, and torpedo aircraft alike, kept hurling themselves at the Japanese carriers with raw courage, and they landed nothing that mattered. That pattern sits at the center of Midway. Wave after wave of American aircraft flew at Nagumo's fleet, and wave after wave broke against it without a decisive hit. From the bridge of Akagi, the picture forming in front of Nagumo looked reassuring. His fighters were knocking down everything the Americans sent, his carriers stood untouched, and the battle, as far as he could see, ran exactly to plan. Underneath that calm, the relentless, uncoordinated attacks were quietly doing damage no one could see yet. They wore at the Japanese defenses, forced the carriers into violent evasive turns that snarled their own flight operations, and dragged the Japanese fighter cover toward exactly the wrong altitude at exactly the wrong moment. The strikes that looked like failures were setting a trap, and the most heartbreaking of them, the one that mattered most, had not yet arrived. Somewhere between 9:20 and 10 in the morning on June 4th, the American carrier torpedo squadrons located the Japanese fleet and went in. What came next ranks among the most lopsided slaughters in the history of naval aviation. The torpedo bombers lumbered along slow and barely armed, and on this particular morning they flew almost completely without fighter protection, pressing low and straight toward the Japanese carriers into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming defenders, and advance historians have set beside the charge of the Light Brigade. The arithmetic states it plainly. 99 aviators crewed the torpedo planes lost that morning, and only 3 of them lived to see the battle end, a survival rate that captures those hours more honestly than any other number in the story. No single unit embodied that sacrifice more fully than Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the carrier Hornet under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Before they launched, Waldron told his men, in essence, that if a single aircraft remained, that pilots should drive straight in and score a hit, and his squadron carried out that order to the very last plane. Every one of Torpedo Squadron 8's 15 aircraft tumbled from the sky, shot down. One man walked away from it, Ensign George Tex Gay, who dropped into the water and watched the rest of the battle play out from the surface of the Pacific, the only living witness left from his entire squadron. It would be easy to shelve this as a tragic, empty gesture, brave men spent for nothing. That reading is wrong. The torpedo squadron scored no hits, and their sacrifice accomplished something no one had drawn up on any plan, because by attacking down low, they hauled the Japanese fighter cover, the combat air patrol, all the way down to the ocean surface to chop them apart. The high altitude above the Japanese fleet, the exact slot a dive bomber attacks from, now lay wide open and unguarded. At that precise moment, by a coincidence no plan could ever have scripted, American dive bombers were sliding into position overhead. The men of the torpedo squadrons died purchasing a few minutes of opportunity they would never know they had bought, and what happened in those minutes would justify, in the cruelest accounting imaginable, every life they spent. The dive bombers that broke over the Japanese fleet had come within a hair of never arriving at all. Wade McCluskey's Enterprise Air Group had flown to the patch of ocean where the Japanese carriers were supposed to be, and found nothing but water, because the enemy had shifted position. McCluskey's planes were now burning fuel they could not afford, hunting across an enormous stretch of the Pacific for a fleet that should have been there and simply was not, and one bad choice now meant ditching into the sea on the long flight home. And that is when McCluskey spotted it, a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, charging hard and by herself across the water to catch up with the main fleet. He gambled, swung his formation onto the destroyer's wake, and rode it straight to the Japanese carriers. Around 10:20 to 10:25 in the morning, The dive bombers dropped out of the sky. Aircraft from Enterprise and from Yorktown, the Yorktown group led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, fell on the Japanese carriers almost without resistance, since the fighters that should have stopped them still churned around down low, mopping up the torpedo planes. Inside a few minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers took mortal damage. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were hit, set ablaze, and condemned, and among the pilot's landing blows that day flew Lieutenant Norman Dusty Clyce, credited with strikes on Kaga, then later on Hiryu and on the cruiser Mikuma. 3 of the finest carriers afloat, veterans of Pearl Harbor, became burning wrecks in less time than it takes to describe it, and the balance of the entire Pacific War tilted in those few minutes off Midway. This narrow window is exactly where the legend of Midway took root. Afterward, everyone wanted the answer to one question: the state those Japanese carriers were in when the bombs landed. The popular version held that they sat helpless one instant and stood seconds from launching a devastating counterstrike the next, and the answer that seized the public imagination and the answer the records actually support are not the same. That gap forms the heart of this story, and it comes next. Here is the version of Midway most people carry in their heads. As the legend goes, when the American dive bomber struck around 10:25, the Japanese carriers stood a mere 5 minutes from launching a full strike of their own. Their flight decks, in this telling, groaned under rows of aircraft armed, fueled, engines already turning, and had the Americans shown up just 5 minutes later, those planes would have clawed into the air and perhaps torn the American carriers apart instead. 5 fateful minutes on which the entire war supposedly balanced. That phrase, 5 fateful minutes, traces to a precise source, a book published under the name of Mitsuo Fuchida, the very officer who had led the Pearl Harbor strike and who rode out Midway aboard the carrier Akagi. Fuchida described the moment in tones of pure disbelief, marveling that the tide of the whole battle could flip in so brief a span, and painting Japanese decks crowded with planes poised to launch and caught at the worst conceivable instant. It works beautifully as storytelling. The account turned the American victory into a coin toss, a miracle of timing, the narrowest of escapes, and for decades it colored nearly every Western retelling of the battle. One problem sits underneath all of it: the Japanese records do not back it up. Starting in 1971, when Japan published its own official war history of the battle, historians began contradicting Fuchida's account head-on. The most exhaustive reckoning landed in 2005, in a book called Shattered Sword, written by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully and built on Japanese primary sources, and they named the relevant chapter, with deliberate edge, a fallacious 5 minutes. The evidence lays out a different picture. When the dive bomber struck, the Japanese carriers stood nowhere near ready to launch. Their flight decks were not jammed with armed and fueled aircraft set to go. The strike planes still sat mostly below in the hangars, and the decks themselves ran largely empty. That cinematic image of perfectly timed catastrophe, bombs falling among ranks of fueled aircraft seconds before takeoff, did not match what actually unfolded. Parshall and Tully do not stand alone, since the historian Dallas Isom arrived at compatible conclusions from Japanese sources, and Craig Simmons did much the same, which has pushed the re-evaluation of the 5 minutes into the mainstream among serious students of the battle. The myth survives for a plain reason: it simply tells a better story than the truth does. A victory decided by 5 miraculous minutes thrills an audience far more than a victory ground out through months of patient code-breaking, the near-annihilation of the torpedo squadrons, and a fuel-starved squadron leader trailing a destroyer's wake, and the legend squeezes a sprawling, hours-long battle down into one cinematic flash. None of the real version diminishes the achievement. If anything, the truth makes the American win look less like luck and more like the payoff of everything that came before it: the intelligence, the ambush, the sacrifice, the sheer persistence. The Japanese carriers did not fall because of a freak 5-minute window. They fell because they had already been outmaneuvered, worn thin, and stripped of their defenses long before the dive bombers ever pushed over. The 5 minutes are a myth, and what stands in their place earns far more respect. The morning of June 4th had killed 3 Japanese carriers, and one still fought on. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had ridden out the dive bomber strike, and she answered. Across the afternoon, Hiryu sent up 2 waves of attacks against the American fleet, and both of them homed in on the carrier Yorktown, pounding her and leaving her badly wounded. So for a stretch of time the Japanese had drawn American blood in return. That comeback did not hold. Late in the afternoon, a scout plane off Yorktown pinpointed Hiryu, and dive bombers from Enterprise tore after her, and the last of Japan's 4 Pearl Harbor carriers ended the day crippled and burning like the other 3. The accounting over the days that followed ran lopsided and merciless. On June 5th, Kaga and Soryu slipped to the bottom, while Akagi and Hiryu, still stubbornly afloat, were scuttled by the Japanese themselves. The next day, American aircraft ran down the Japanese heavy cruiser Mikuma and sent her under, battering her sister ship Mogami in the process. The Americans did not walk away clean. The crippled Yorktown sat under tow, with crews battling to save her, when the Japanese submarine I-168 hunted her down on June 7th, and its torpedoes ripped into both the carrier and the destroyer USS Hamman lying alongside. Hamman split apart and went down fast, while Yorktown clung on through the night before she finally rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, and her loss closed the battle. When the final figures came in, the scale of Japan's disaster stood exposed. Japan had lost all 4 of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Estimates of Japanese aircraft losses stretch from around 248 carrier planes up past 320 once the rest are counted, and the Japanese dead are usually placed somewhere between roughly 2,500 and a little over 3,000 men. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hamman, somewhere near 145 to 150 aircraft, and 307 men killed. One number buried in those casualty lists topples a common assumption. People often say Midway gutted Japan's naval air arm by slaughtering its pilots, and the records tell a different story, because a large share of the Japanese aircrew actually survived, with some accounts putting the carrier deaths at only about 36 aviators and another 70 or so lost in the air. What Japan could never replace turned out not to be the men. It was the ships themselves, along with the irreplaceable pool of skilled mechanics and deck crews who rowed them down into the Pacific. The carriers formed the beating heart of Japanese naval power, and 4 of the very best vanished in a matter of days. The question of why Midway matters has a standard answer. Midway stands as the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment Japan's streak of victories ran out and its strategic initiative broke for good, and that view holds wide agreement because the hard facts back it. For frontline carriers lost in one battle was a blow Japan could not absorb. Even that judgment carries a quiet argument inside it. A number of historians point out that the United States, with its overwhelming industrial and shipbuilding muscle, was going to win the Pacific War one way or another, so Midway shortened the road rather than choosing the destination, and that challenge to the decisive battle label deserves a hearing rather than a brush-off. The fair reading lands here. Midway proved decisive in the way that counted most of the time, since it swept Japan's sharpest weapon off the board and handed the initiative to the United States years before American factories would have settled the matter on their own. The battle also left a personal controversy that historians still chew over: the conduct of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Once the carrier action ended, Spruance steered his force east, away from the retreating Japanese, instead of driving the pursuit home, and the criticism followed, with the historian Samuel Morrison faulting the decision back in 1949. His defenders have hit back hard, and Clay Blair, writing in 1975, argued that a night chase would have flung Spruance's ships into a surface brawl against Yamamoto's still formidable heavy units, the battleships among them, on exactly the terms the Japanese had mastered, so caution in this light reads not as timidity but as the right call. The story refused to end in 1942. Searchers located the wreck of the Yorktown on the floor of the Pacific in 1998, in an expedition that included Robert Ballard, the same explorer famous for finding the Titanic, and in 2019 a deep-sea team tracked down the wreckage of two of the Japanese carriers, Kaga and Akagi, lying far below the surface. The atoll that the whole battle had raged over now serves as a national wildlife refuge, home to one of the planet's great seabird colonies, a hushed place today that sits hard against everything that once happened in the water around it. Understanding of the battle keeps shifting too. Shattered Sword still anchors the modern scholarship, and it has reshaped how Midway gets taught, drawing the truth out, slowly, from beneath the legend, while the battle has reached the screen twice, in films released in 1976 and again in 2019, each one layering on its own coat of popular memory, all of which circles back to where this began. The story you have most likely heard, the 5 miraculous minutes, the decks loaded with doomed aircraft, is the version that hardened into legend. The version the records actually preserve runs harder and far less cinematic, an ambush laid by codebreakers, a trap sprung by a lie about drinking water, torpedo squadrons wiped out nearly to the last man, and a fleet beaten as much by patience and sacrifice as by any single dramatic instant. The 5 minutes that won the Pacific War never really happened, and what won it was everything else, which, in the end, makes the better story.